Hi, GANEL-LYN Condi for Come Follow Me Study Helps. I say this every week. I'm so excited to talk to you about this week's reading, but I am every week. I'm excited. I don't think next year's going to change much because we're doing Book of Mormon, but I have loved the New Testament. I hope you have too. We are finishing the 2nd Corinthians. Oh my gosh, next week Galatians. Isn't that exciting? So Paul, oh my gosh, I have fallen in love with Paul even more this week. These are some of the most endearing verses and interchanges between Paul and the people of Corinth. So we're going to get right to it. I'm going to put my glasses on. So, because I want to read some quotes to you. Paul goes and asks the members to give of what they have to the poor. And I'm going to just say something here. We have been unemployed multiple times, underemployed. And I'm going to tell you something that I have seen as a pattern. Those that have been the most generous and supportive to our family have been those that don't necessarily have a lot. I have watched an awesome reality television show called The Kindness Diaries. And if you are familiar with that, it's on BYU TV. I love it. And there's one episode where the host goes to probably the most wealthiest place he could go. It's like the craziest experience. He cannot find a place to stay. The stories that he has is that he has to be given help, a place to sleep, food, all of that. He can't be given money. And then he goes to India, and the poorest of families give him the most. And I think Paul is really saying, I don't care how much you think you have or you don't have. What do you have to give? And really, we're all beggars. He goes on to talk about this. Verse 14 of 2 Corinthians 8. What I would like to ask in our families is to talk about what you have in abundance. Everyone has abundance. There's been a time in our lives where we had nothing, quote unquote, because there was no job. But I would monthly go through our closets, and if there were things we could donate, that was an abundance we didn't need anymore as an offering, so that spiritually my heart was in that abundance mindset. So for our neighbors, they have an abundance of vegetables right now, so we're getting some of those things and we're trying to share what we have. And so maybe you could discuss as a family where you have some abundance and you can share. The missionaries of Titus are there. There's a discussion here about how did they pay for these missions and the tithing that is used to get everyone where they need to go. And I wanted to share a quote from James Faust about how sacred funds are handled, because sometimes this is a discussion in General Conference. We vote and we sustain, and there's an accounting report. And President Faust said in 1998, "Rest assured that the tithes of this church are administered as set forth in the revelation given in 1838 to the prophet Joseph Smith. The 18 church leaders designated in the 120th section of the D&C meet together to administer these sacred funds." And Paul was dealing with this discussion of how were the funds being handled. Paul comes to Corinth, and he is so loving in these chapters. He says, I love you so many times, and it just makes me love him even more. In 2 Corinthians 9, he's asking, are we cheerful givers? In verse 7, are we cheerful givers? And where much is given, we receive much back. We hear that where much is given, much is expected. But also, I've seen that those that are very generous seem to always have more coming back to them. And so I think that is such a beautiful, powerful principle Paul's trying to teach them. If you hold on to those talents and bury them under the stand, they don't increase. But if you share them in the world, it increases. Hello, Dolly, one of my favorite musicals. If you'll remember the quote, and I don't mean to be irreverent, but that's what you get for real here. She says, her late husband, Ephraim, always said, money is like manure. It should be spread around, helping young things to grow. And so I think Paul's trying to teach that principle. There's a great many ideas shared here. Specifically, there's a quote by Brigham Young that I wanted to share with you, and I hope that it adds to this conversation. That Brigham Young is he's trying to teach also this same blessings will be flowing into your life as you give. And so he's asking, I don't have the quote right in front of me. Sorry, I couldn't find it, where he was asking the saints, what do you have at home? What do you have extra? But are you cheerful about it? Or if you're not going to share of your flock and field, then it's going to mildew. And that's classic Brigham Young. I love 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 10 through 15. I'm going to invite all of you to have those be your new Thanksgiving verses. Read them. I'm not going to read them here, but they are great for Thanksgiving. I think Thanksgiving in America gets overlooked. I know I have international viewers that are like, what's Thanksgiving? And in November here in America, we celebrate Thanksgiving, and we don't have as great of decorations and music like with Christmas. And these verses, I'm going to challenge us to make them the new Thanksgiving verses because I think they're beautiful. Chapter 10, this is the war of the flesh versus the war of the spirit. And Paul is saying basically, like, your addictions, your learning disabilities, your depression or anxiety, whatever it is physically that we're fighting, instead of fighting the flesh with flesh, but fight with spiritual warfare. So maybe in your families, you could talk about what spiritual weapons do we have? Prayer, fasting, temple, scripture study, forgiveness, right? Taking the sacrament is the biggest spiritual weapon we've got to help us each week. And then he goes into this comparison and judging of leaders. And I think it's important to note that today President Nelson just gave a devotional at BYU, and he said that rarely are prophets popular, and appreciated. And so when we're judging and we're looking at our leaders and we're trying to decide who's popular and who frames what we should be thinking, the influencers, these are great chapters to talk about. Who are the influencers, and what voices are we listening to? And we're going to talk a little bit about how to discern a righteous leader. But I love what Joseph Fielding Smith said in 1976 about what Paul looked like. Okay, so Paul loved the people, but they didn't always love him back. This is how he described him. He is about 5 feet high, very dark hair, dark complexion, dark skin, large Roman nose, sharp face, small black eyes, penetrating as eternity, round shoulders, a whining voice, except when elevated, and then it almost resembled the roaring of a lion. Isn't that an interesting description of the Apostle Paul? I love that. So then Paul, remember last week I talked about the jealousy of God, that he's not really jealous. And I said to you, it's more like he has a marriage and he wants to have nothing between you and him because he loves you so much. Paul totally substantiates what I said last week. I forgot that he was going to say this, that he has a godly jealousy because he also compares it to a marriage. He doesn't want anything to be in between. Do we get caught in the weeds in the gospel, or do we keep it simple? I think 2 Corinthians 11, I think it's really important to know that we're getting to the basics of, is Christ within us? Are we eyes on Jesus, or are we getting caught into the weeds? And he talks about abasing himself. Abasing himself is a word for humility. And he expresses all of this love. He keeps saying, I love you, verse 11. It reminded me today of President Nelson and how much he expressed the love that he felt for each of us. And now in chapter 11, this discussion of false teachers. How do we know if someone's a false prophet or a false teacher? Maybe this is a great discussion for your family. What are their fruits? What is their why? Who are they serving? What are they sacrificing? And so instead of looking at followers and fans and ego, Satan, it says here, Paul's like, can transform himself. I want to share another President Faust quote. It's powerful. Who has not heard felt the enticing of the devil? His voice often sounds so reasonable and his message so easy to justify. It is an appealing, intriguing voice with the dulcet tones. It is neither hard nor discordant. No one would listen to Satan's voice if it sounded harsh or mean. If the devil's voice were unpleasant, it would not persuade people to listen to it. Isn't that an interesting thought? Okay. We're running out of time here. I just want to say that I love that Paul talks about the thorn that he prayed away 3 times and it was not removed, but he glories in those afflictions? Can we see our addictions, our depression, our struggles to be the weak areas where Christ's grace can show up? And then he ends with a kiss. And I'm a hugger, and so I end this message with a hug and a kiss to you this week. I hope this has blessed you.